Okay, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, the moment that we all been waiting for. We have the man, the myth, and the legend, none other than Laird Scranton here with us tonight. And we're here to talk about the science behind ancient Egyptian and the Dogon symbolism. I can't think of a better person to have this conversation with. I mean, you're thorough, bro. I was just telling you, I've got a stack of your books. Oh, it's not showing up because it's filter right there, but believe me, y'all, I got a stack of his books.
You're the guy who bought a copy.
Right. Yep. So we're gonna jump right in. So Laird, I mean, thank you so much, man, for being available tonight. I really sure. I've seen your work. I've been following you for decades at this point. You know, I feel like I'm getting old to say decades, but I was first introduced to your work. I was watching Magical Egypt.
Right.
You know, and I saw you know, you did an interview there with J. Anthony West. And his book is Serpent in the Sky, you know, was very much enlightened by his book. And, you know, it was really interesting because when I'm watching like videos and lectures and interviews, I always check out the bookshelves behind people. I'm sure you probably do that.
Yeah, I do that too, yeah.
And you had a book on your shelf. It was the Medu Neter Volume 1 by Ra Nefer Amen.
Actually, that was John's bookshelf. That was the day I met John. He invited me to meet him, and he didn't tell me he was going to film it.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And yeah, he had a library of just brilliant books, you know.
Okay. Because so you know, I know Ron Nefer Amen personally. He's one of my spiritual teachers.
Wow.
I've actually been initiated, you know, into his organization as one of the priests in the priesthood there. So, you know, dealing with African spirituality, you know, and the Kemetic sciences is something that's very near and dear to me. And so when I saw that book behind you, you know, everybody in the community was a buzz. Like, wait, hold on, y'all see on the shelf? You know, you know, because it's not often that, you know, works like that, you know, get a glimpse into the mainstream, you know.
Right.
You know, and so, you know, I say all that just to say, you know, I thank you and I appreciate the work that you've done. And I really look forward to, you know, what it is that will come out of our communication tonight.
Great. Well, I'm open for whatever happened. This sounds like fun.
Yeah. So do us this solid. For those who are being introduced to you for the first time tonight, tell us a little bit about yourself, your background. I know you're a computer programmer. Tell us a little bit about Laird Scranton.
Okay. I was born on the West Coast. I came to the East Coast for college. I got a degree in English, and my campus job for financial aid was programming computers. When I graduated, programming was a marketable skill, and I ended up becoming an independent software designer for businesses. So I worked with business programming languages for a couple of decades. Then in the mid to late 1990s, my wife actually gave me a book called Unexplained by Jerome Clark, where each chapter was about some great mystery that hadn't been solved yet. And one of the chapters was focused on the Dogon tribe in Mali. And I thought, wow, I mean, the main thrust was about knowledge they had about astronomy, about the stars of Sirius, and how it's information that they shouldn't have had without access to technology. So I thought, wow, wherever this leads me is going to be interesting. I wanted to try to get to the bottom of it. And so I started exploring it. I bought Robert Temple's book called The Sirius Mystery, and then I started following his bibliography, exploring as many of the sources as I could just to learn more about it. And I was keeping notes for myself about what I was learning. I had no intention of writing an article or a book. And I eventually realized I had enough material to write a book, to self-publish a book. And it was organized in a manner that it would be an easy thing to do it. So I ended up self-publishing a book called Hidden Meanings. Mm-hmm. And that book found Egyptologist John Anthony West, and he reached out to me and invited me to do the segment for Magical Egypt, and so took me around to conferences and introduced me to people, and sort of gave me my entree into the publishing and the conference world. So since then, what I've been trying to do is my books have mostly moved geographically. My approach is a comparative one. The Dogon tribe is a great starting point for that because they have societal elements that are sort of an umbrella over ancient Judaism, ancient Egypt, and Buddhism. And in addition, their symbolic tradition has intimate connections with Hinduism. So basically, my process is to take a flat statement that the Dogon priests make and then test the nuances of that against the other traditions that preserve the same elements, that have the same symbol or the same concept or the same set of words. And there are all sorts of different comparative sources to test things against. There are other African tribes. There are all the classic cosmological traditions. And very quickly you begin to see that, as Carl Jung did, that these are archetypes that are found all over the world. They clearly all originated in one place, and just trying to trace things back to original meanings is my process.
Nice. And so your book, Hidden Meanings, I'm the type of dude that if I'm watching a lecture or something and somebody mentions a book, Amazon is the devil. So I like immediately I go on and I order the book. Yeah. And so
hidden meanings that you can't find.
Right, exactly. And so I've got a copy of Unexplained sitting over here on the corner of my desk right now because I heard you mention it. So I wanted to see where you were first introduced, right? But then your book, Hidden Meanings, I searched and I searched and I searched, man. I ended up paying probably like $150 for that book.
Man.
But then
that got republished as The Science of the Dogon, and I was required to withdraw Hidden Meanings from sale when I signed the publishing agreement.
Right. So, and that's crazy because about 3 months after I bought Hidden Meanings, I bought The Science of the Dogon. I realized it was the same book.
Right. No, I'm so sorry.
It's okay, man. I mean, I'm a collector of books, so I mean, I value it either way. And so what I will do though is if I ever see you in person, I'm gonna get you to sign it for me, so I can say I've got the original joint signed, right?
Great, perfect.
Cool, man. So answer me this though. Okay, so you've got this background in computer programming. My background's in psychology, and so what is it about the cognitive process of being a computer programmer? Because you have to have a unique perspective. So what is it about that particular skill set, that cognitive process, that allows you to go in and decode the symbolisms of ancient Egypt, I believe it's the Hindu as well, and right, the Dogon?
Well, the first thing about it is writing a computer program is working with symbols. They teach you in algebra class, to use X, Y, and Z as variables. And most programmers start out sort of doing that, setting up variables that are named like that. But after a while, you realize that, 5 years from now, I have to get my brain back into this program I wrote 5 years before. And I can't do that if it's all X's, Y's, and Z's. And so you sort of learn techniques for naming things that are more intuitive than that. And that's what the symbolic tradition is all about. These are very intuitive symbols. Mm-hmm. The second thing is that I was being brought in to solve problems for companies that either didn't want to do a project or didn't have the talent on their staff to accomplish a project. And so a lot of times it was involving solving some subtle problem with a program that wasn't working. Yeah. But this is a system I had never seen before. And I used to joke that I was being expected to know more and more and more with less and less information, that one day I'd be expected to know everything with no information. Well, that's exactly where the creational tradition is you have to be able to figure out, you have to be able to have criteria to judge what must be true based on not necessarily a complete overview of what the facts are. Mm-hmm. So to be able to judge based on other factors, what direction the truth lies in, to find ways to try to cross-check that. As I said, language is a huge piece of it. A lot of the Dogon cosmological words are ancient Egyptian words. And there's an advantage with the Dogon language in that it's only a spoken language. They've rejected adopting a written language for the same reasons that Socrates didn't like written language. Mm-hmm. Every Dogon syllable represents a concept. And so the Dogon dictionary essentially documents what those syllables are. And then they combine them, they mix and match them as building blocks to build larger concepts, or words for larger concepts. So any Dogon word, I can judge what the word likely means based on the syllables that are used to express it.
Mm-hmm.
That's the same way the Egyptian hieroglyphic language works, that in the hieroglyphs, each drawn character, each glyph represents a concept. And if you sort of like a child's rebus puzzle, where you see a picture of an eye and you substitute the word eye and you build a little sentence. Well, that's the way you read Egyptian words, is by substituting concepts for glyphs. And then the sentence that you build explains to you what the original intended meaning was of that word. Wow. You know what the scribe was thinking when he wrote it, because the symbols tell you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So it stops being guesswork very quickly. There are even words that assign meanings to their own glyphs. So eventually you can lay out the meanings of hundreds of glyphs based on the authority of the language, not based on somebody's guesswork.
Wow. Yeah, and see, we're gonna take a deep dive into that, a little bit later in the conversation, because I'm fascinated, especially the way you broke down the word ma'at. Because, like you said, I mean, like we all know it's the truth, reciprocity, justice, righteousness, it's like the cliche of it. And, I get it, but that's never sat solid with me, right? Because I'm like you, I've looked at these words. I did a presentation at the Schomburg probably about 8 years ago at this point. And I was talking about the symbolist perspective of ancient Egypt, right? And one of the things that I was pushing was the interpretation of the hieroglyphics or the Medu Neter as words, not necessarily a symbol for letter translation to build a word,
right,
but to understand each individual glyph as a concept in and of itself.
Right.
And I just think, it's those multiple layers, though, right, that these African symbols exist on. There's a concept in the Dogon, I'm going to butcher it. It's like the Jiri soul, so I'm looking at the word from the front, from the side, that concept, yeah.
Right.
And so I think that we look at words that way, but then it's also a way to look at reality as a whole.
Right.
And so I really want we're going to take a dive into that. In fact, I've got a couple of hieroglyphic phrases saved that I'm going to put on the screen, like especially the word ma'at. And I would like you, if you don't mind, to do that exercise with us, at least with the word ma'at, to show us how you come up with this. I mean, this is fascinating stuff, man.
Okay.
If that's cool with you. So
I'd be happy to do that. Yep.
All right, so I got another question about Laird Scranton. So would you say that this is your part of your life purpose? I mean, because you've gone in, man, you're basically, to use I'm tongue in cheek, of course, you're obsessed with this. I mean, you've gone in, you've taken a deep dive, you've gone from continent to continent, culture to culture, actually looking, I mean, figuratively speaking, looking at these symbols, looking at the culture, and you are bringing forth some amazing insights. So would you yourself say that this is a part of your destiny and your life purpose?
That's a hard question to answer. Early in my process, I was invited by a friend of John Anthony West to meet him in New York City at a diner to have lunch and talk about my book, Hidden Meanings. But at the very last minute, he asked if he could invite a friend to the lunch, and I said, sure, why not? I don't care. The more the merrier. Yeah. So I get there and I discovered the lunch isn't really with him. It's with his quote unquote friend. And she's not his friend. She's his spiritual advisor.
Wow.
I happened to have my son who was in New York City with me, and my wife took the train with me from Albany to go into the meeting. And so I had witnesses to what happened. But the entire meeting consisted of this woman who was a very odd woman, so odd that my wife and my son and I all came away with somewhat different impressions of what she was really like. Mm. But the entire meeting consisted of this woman asking me personal questions about my life and then listening to my answer. And then she explained to me how my answer ties back to the symbolism I'm researching.
Wow.
For example, she said, describe your marriage to me. And I said, I've always thought of our marriage as the large overlap of two circles. And she said, that's a symbol. That's the Vesica Pisces. Do you realize that? Not only that, when you get down to the bottom of the energetics, that's where the concept of marriage comes from, is that exact same symbol. The concept of an embrace between non-material and material energies, feminine and masculine energies coming together, is the basis of marriage. Mm-hmm. So I learned from that meeting that there was a whole lot going on that connects directly to me with this symbolism that I hadn't realized before. It was all transparent to me before that. Mm-hmm. To make matters worse, as the books have progressed, a lot of the references that are key to the cosmology come back to things that have meaning for me personally, to the point where by the time I was looking at the the village of Skara on Orkney Island in northern Scotland. This was a site that had been covered over for thousands of years, and then in the mid 1800s, a corner of this site was uncovered by a series of storms that hit the island. And the site sits on the land of a noble in Scotland known as the Laird of Scale. I thought, wow, things have come around to the point where it comes right back to my actual name. I mean, that's crazy.
Yeah, I mean, like you couldn't write a script, you know what I mean? That would match the reality, right?
Right. When I was studying Chinese, I was writing a book about China's cosmology. All of the early mythical emperors of China have little mythical storylines written about them that explain who they were and where they lived and where they traveled and what things they were remembered for having done. And it also gives the name of the emperor. Well, it turns out that if you use an Egyptian hieroglyphic dictionary, all of those elements referenced in the myth tie back to a single phonetic that is the name of the emperor.
Wow. Wow.
Okay, now I thought these people could not possibly be historical characters because that's not the way things work. You can't have their life play out in terms of the symbolism that neatly. But now I realize that 500 years from now, somebody looking back on me reading my books is going to see exactly the same thing and decide I can't have been a historical character. I had to be mythical.
That's right. That's right. And that's a question I got for you later too about the mythical characters. I hear you say that a lot. And I'm going to push back just a little bit on the mythical side of it, because as you're saying, what's being revealed to you is that there might be that level of order, to our existence, even on a social level, right?
Yep.
you told the story about how you came up on the book Unexplained, right? And how, somebody just sent the box of books as they were clearing out and they happened to be in there or something like that.
Well, actually, that's a different book. Because I was following along Temple's bibliography to sort of get a foothold into what I was studying. One of the books I needed was called Ancient Near Eastern Texts.
That's right.
Relating to the New Testament or the Old Testament.
That's right.
And so this is a big, 700-page volume book that was out of print.
I ordered that one too, by the way.
This is in the late 1900s, before you could just go online and order a book. And so I had exhausted all of the used bookstores and all of the new bookstores. Nobody could order the book for me. No one had the book. I even went to the Vassar College interlibrary loan service to see if they could get me the book. I thought if anybody could, they could, and they couldn't get me the book. So I finally, sort of discouraged, went back to my wife and said, I'm not going to be able to find that book I need. And a couple of days later, a box turned up on our back doorstep, sent to my wife by an aging cousin of hers in Queens, New York. He lived in a small apartment in a big high rise, and every so often he'd sort of reach terminal capacity in his apartment with all the possessions he had. And he would toss a bunch of random crap into a box and mail it off to some unsuspecting relative. Right. Well, in that box was my book. And it was at that point that I understood that there are things going on in the world that we don't understand. We can't explain yet.
It reminds me as well, the whole concept, and I don't know if it's in physics or which discipline it would be in, but when your attention to a wave will impact the wave, right, it would draw the attention of it. I've read about that before. I've heard you speak about it, and in research, it's the reason for double blind. It's the reason why a researcher would try to remove themselves from the exact vicinity of the actual experiment that's taking place. Right. And when I think about that, and when I heard you speak about it most recently, I was thinking talking about the Nomo, thinking about if these are, these immaterial, non-human beings that are responsible for transmitting this original knowledge to people. And I'm gonna ask you to tell that story in a minute because I'm gonna butcher it because I couldn't retell it. But if these are actually, these beings, made up of energy and whatnot, then our attention towards them would then quote unquote disrupt the wave and bring their attention to us. And it was the way that from listening to it, I was thinking wait a minute, that's the science behind prayer then. If you're praying to God, you're disrupting the wave or at least getting the attention of that energy. And then it has to decide, just like in the book, in the Bible, when somebody touched the hem of Jesus's garment, say, who touched me? right? It got his attention, and then by virtue of getting his attention, she was healed.
Well, the outlook on this is that we're dealing with a continuum of energy that the Dogon describe as 14 superposed domains. Now, I'll try to explain what they mean by that. You know that in the deepest parts of the ocean, that deep seawater naturally segments itself into biological zones, and different types of sea life prefer to live in different zones. Some prefer to live near the surface. Some are bottom dwellers, and there's everything in between, depending on how much sunlight they need, or what kind of water pressure they can stand, or what temperature of water they want, and other factors like that. And there are certain creatures who can only survive in their zone. They can only, certain bottom dwellers, they can't move out of that zone. They have no capacity to move up to the surface. Right. But there are other creatures like a whale that can cross all the domains at once and go wherever it wants to.
That's right.
So that's Rene Guénon's perspective on consciousness, on the concept of being, that we're dealing with that kind of a superposition of elements that are all active at once. Another way to describe it is in an individual cell, there are reactions that make a living biological cell work. But those reactions happen on a whole range of different time frames that are associated with these energetic domains. From the very quickest ones, which is sort of the range at which molecular interactions happen, where an electron attaches to an atom. Very super ultra quick reaction, but every reaction sort of shifts things into the next zone, into the next zone, into the next zone, and the net of all of that produces the living cell. It's the same way with consciousness and with living beings, that what we see at the surface here is only a segment of what really goes into creating a living being.
Wow. Yeah, man. Okay, so we hey, y'all, get ready to put on your scuba gear, because we're going to, speaking about the depths of the ocean, we're going to slowly and gradually go deeper and deeper, to keep us from having, I think it's the bends when you come up too fast. I'm sure you can't go down too fast either. So we're going to take it slow and, and slowly descend into the depths of this conversation, brother. I mean, I'm just so fascinated by the content and the subject matter. And, to have somebody who can break it down in plain language, such as, we've got other people like Dr. Charles Finch, who has done, some very deep and extensive studies on the Dogon as well, the Kemetic spiritual system. We got, of course, Marimba Ani, Mama Marimba. She's actually the first person to introduce me to the Dogon, wow, with her book Yurugu, and so it's just this, we've got this wealth of knowledge, and I believe it's like the body of Osir. We've got all these pieces all over the place, and it's up to us to put them all back together, right?
Right. You've just described the dynamic of consciousness. Consciousness is the ability to see a thing in overview, break it down into its components, and then put it back together again. And that's the myth of Osiris, as you were saying. And it's a definition of how the continuum of energy itself works on whatever scale you want to look at it at, whether you're talking about how matter forms, or how biological life forms, or how consciousness forms. It's all the same progression of energy.
You say Genesis is Genesis, right? No matter what level you're talking about it, right?
That's right. That's right. Yep. It doesn't matter what dimensional level you look at. Doesn't matter.
Scale.
Yeah. It's all the same.
And it reminds me now, because if we're talking about creation, the concept of the Egyptian or Kemetic concept of Ptah, and Kep-Ra as well, right? Those are two symbols for generation and creation. What's your view on those symbols?
I mean, I'd have to specifically see the word that we're talking about, or the symbol that we're talking about, to give you an opinion about it. Gotcha. Because there's a lot of variation in how they're presented, and sometimes a little difference makes a difference in how you interpret it.
That's right.
But one of the projects I've been working on sort of on the side is to try to trace the derivation of each of these glyphs. What I'm doing is the intention is to never use a glyph in an explanation of a meaning that I haven't already defined. So this is a derivation from bottom up, so that when someone like you asks, how do I know what makes me think that this glyph means a particular thing? I have the whole map laid out. We get to it this way in these steps.
Wow. Kind of like a flow chart, a Venn diagram, if you will.
Right. And just a justification for what is it that makes us think that this glyph means this thing.
Got you. I was going to mention earlier, you mentioned consciousness and that definition. I've seen that. I've heard you mention that before, and I've seen it written. Basically the ability to take something on the macro and bring it down to micro, right?
Right. That's also a definition of quantum coherence.
Tell me about that.
Quantum coherence is, it's basically the state of superconductivity. Superconductivity is a situation where magnetism is dormant, but electricity flows unresisted. Mm-hmm. It's the starting point actually for manifestation of material forms. Mm-hmm. But quantum coherence is a situation where I have a biologist who compares it to she compares it to a jazz combo. She says every player in a jazz combo has ultimate freedom to do what they want to and to express themselves in the way they want, but in a context that is in harmony with the theme that the entire group is playing. That's quantum coherence, only with energy. That every event and every transaction that happens energetically happens independently on its own localized level, but also is in harmony with what's happening on the broad level. And that every organism, according to her, is quantum coherent, from a tiny worm to a human being.
Wow. And so it's almost like there are parameters put on the freedom of expression, so to speak. So
right, there's a context, right?
Okay. And so, like, for example, if we're talking about the manifestation of another human being, right, it's going to be built from the materials of other human beings, but how it expresses can have some variation within that realm of expression.
Right. I mean, like if you were assigned to, a class was assigned to write a poem, now you're all working in the same context, but you have ultimate freedom to write your poem the way you want to write the poem.
Right. But there will be poems produced at the end.
Right.
Or else you're going to fail. Yeah. So let me ask you this, Laird. So I was going back to that concept, background of psychology, I'm a psychologist. So when I look at consciousness, I see consciousness two different ways. And of course, we can define it many, many ways. But I like to teach the students that consciousness is degrees of awareness as well as degrees of awakeness.
Okay.
And so I just switch out the K and the R, so to speak. And that's how I help them remember those two, right?
That's good. That's excellent.
And now check this out. So you could be wide awake, meaning your brain activity, frequency have you in a state of awareness and conscious interaction, right?
Right.
We use the word to define the word, but interaction intentionally with the world. But then you can have minimum awareness of what's actually going on around you, right?
Right. Right.
Many of us have been wide awake and missed the gorilla that ran across the screen while the kids were passing the basketball, right?
Right.
And then you could. Mm-hmm.
Part of this is because it's the nature of consciousness. One of the examples that I use is, the optical illusion of the two faces that create the image of a vase.
Yep.
Human consciousness is such that it can't focus clearly on both images at the same time. It can only see one or the other. Mm. But human intelligence is such that we can grasp what an optical illusion is. It's not that it's not knowable. It just, we can't actively perceive all aspects of it in one go. Huh. So that's what Tibetan Buddhism means when they say that this material is ultimately unknowable. That's all they're really saying is that it works like an optical illusion. It's not that we can't grasp the dynamics of it and the principles of it. It's that you can't take it all in one look.
And so along those same lines, and I've got the illusion. I know some people love visuals. So I want to see if I can't start bringing in some visuals. Can you see this right now, Laird?
Yeah, I do. Yep, there's my faces and vase, right.
Okay, and so this is the optical illusion. Now, do you think, or have you seen anywhere in any of the ancient cultures to where there is a process for developing the ability to see them both at the same time?
Yeah, the Dogon system is, well, they're not representing that you can see them both at one time. What they're trying to develop is something called discriminating knowledge, which is the understanding that you can't see them both at one time.
Okay, and by understanding that you can't, that shifts your perceptual awareness.
Right, because now you know to look for both forms of it. If you want to get your arms around the whole thing, you need to know to look for both pieces of it. Okay, I'll give you a really good example of that. There's, I had spent a long time studying what happens with the hydrogen atom. And I thought I was finished researching what I wanted to know about it. And then a crop circle turned up in the UK this year. A friend of mine sent me a photo of this crop circle, and I could see that what was laid out in the crop circle was the configuration of a hydrogen atom.
Wow.
But there was something at the center that I didn't understand what it was. And so I went to do some research and discovered that what it was a representation of what's called the first resonant state of a hydrogen atom. It's something I had not considered resonance in terms of a hydrogen atom.
Explain that, please.
Okay. Energy is like sound. Mm-hmm. If we want to think about the notes of a musical scale, you have infinite number of frequencies between the first note and the second note. But the reason the second note becomes the second note is because it's a point of resonance. It's a point that where the frequencies of the vibrations that are happening fit perfectly with each other.
Gotcha.
Okay, so the resonant state of things is important. So it turns out, because of that crop circle, I continued to look, and what I discovered was that back in the early 1900s, a French aristocrat named de Broglie wrote a very important paper on the resonant states of hydrogen atoms. And that paper became the foundation of Heisenberg's quantum theory. But in the process, de Broglie's paper got lost in the mix. No, it didn't go forward from there. No one ever mentioned it. It never even got translated into English. And it wasn't until 2018 that a French astronomer published an article mentioning it. And when I went to read the information from de Broglie, I discovered that what he had documented, what he had actually graphed, when he's talking about the resonant state of a hydrogen atom, states of a hydrogen atom, he's talking that, electrons, when you add energy into a hydrogen atom, the electron shifts outward. There are orbital shells for electrons. He says those orbital shells are resonant states.
Wow. And
so what he graphs is the cyclical influence of that magnetism has on an electron. That shape is the Egyptian mouth glyph.
Wow.
And then he graphs the cyclical influence of magnetism on the components of a proton, and that shape is the Egyptian single wave glyph. Now, when you take those two shapes and you look in the Egyptian hieroglyphic dictionary for a word that's written with just the two shapes, what you come up with is what Budge calls the divine name.
That's right.
It's the hidden aspect of deity. Yeah, because it's the aspect of energy that's not immediately apparent. You have to look for it. It's the vase that's hidden between the two faces.
Let me see if I can pull up that glyph real quick so people can see what we're talking about here. This is fascinating stuff, Laird. So, to say the least.
Yeah.
Let me see if I can. Well, no, I've actually pulled up the flag. So it's what's the word, the specific word for that, or how we translate it?
Okay, let's see if I. The word is Budge translates it as Ren, R-E-N or R-E-N-N.
Right, and sometimes we say the Ren is the name or the sacred name. Yeah.
Right, but I know that based on cosmological phonetics, the proper name should be because Egyptian hieroglyphs, they didn't write the vowel sounds, just as in the Hebrew language they didn't write the vowel sounds. You were talking about do we find any techniques to train us to see the vase? Mm-hmm. Both of those languages do, because they make us imagine what the vowel sound is between the two consonants. We're imagining the vase between the faces.
Right.
Now that I know based on cosmological syllables that the proper name should be Re Na. Re is a word for energy, and Na is a term for the non-material feminine. And so this is the aspect of non-material energy that everything comes from.
So I found it right here, but it's in a sentence. I'm gonna pull it up just a second, brother. Yeah, so we're scooting ahead into this part of the conversation. And I'm okay with the free flow part of it.
Sorry about that.
No, man, no. It's it'll be a point to where I relinquish trying to direct the conversation and just let it go. But there are some things I want to make sure that we do touch on, and this is what we're touching on. So here we have Ren right here. You've got the mouth. Can you see it?
Right, and the single wave glyph below it, the energy.
Right, and you were saying that this mouth here is when you put energy into the resonant energy into the electron of an atom. Speak on that.
That is the graph of how magnetism grows and diminishes as an electron orbits a hydrogen atom.
Got you. So this is an orbit, so to speak. Is
right.
That what you're saying?
Well, that's not the orbit. It's you can imagine, okay, if someone was turning the sound of the volume of music up and then down and then up and then down and up and then down. That's what's happening with magnetism as the electron orbits.
Like a pulsation.
It's good. It's expanding and contracting. This is the oscillation of a dipole. It's the same dynamic that controls an electrical dipole or a magnetic dipole. It's the same dynamic that is the energy of the two universes. On every scale, we find it. Okay, now another meaning for the same glyphs, Budge interprets it to refer to the nursing of a small infant. But I can tell from the formation of the word and the glyphs used, the final glyph assigned to it, that what it really means is to perceive the mother. That when you understand what these energies are, what you have done effectively is you've perceived the concept of right now, which is the concept of this feminine consciousness that is sort of occupying that root, the primordial state of energy. It's the couple of times you get glimpses of it, it's very sweet and friendly consciousness. It's not deified. It's treated just as Rene Guénon treats it just as another of the equal states of consciousness, which he says on their own terms are all equal, that there's no real hierarchy to it, that in its own context, each state is as limited as the human state of consciousness is, but they all work together.
Right. And if there is any type of hierarchy to it, would it be just a difference in the vibratory essence of it, so to speak, higher vibration, lower?
Actually, one of the references I came up with this week indicates that along this continuum of energy where we have basically 2 octaves of notes, you have 14 resting points that are resonance points. Mm-hmm. From any of the perspective of any one of those resonance points, if you look back up the scale from where you came from, 10 stages back, it looks like the source to you.
Wow.
Because what we have are shifting time frames. There's a progressive slowing of time that's involved. And so it's, that if you took a video of traffic on a highway at night, when you play the video back at regular speed, you see each individual car with its individual headlights moving along the highway. But the more you speed up that video playback, pretty soon you're not seeing individual lights, you're seeing streaks of light that look like energy.
Right.
Okay. That's the effect that a slowing time frame is having, is that from our perspective, when we look back up the scale at something that it isn't clear to us that it experiences a much quicker pace of time than we do, anything we would look at would look like energy to us in that time scale.
Wow.
But that's true. That's true for the entire continuum. It doesn't matter which resting point you're at along the continuum. If you look back up the scale from where you're at, it looks like energy.
Wow. So it's kind of like a proportional differentiation. No matter where you are, the difference is the difference.
Right.
Tell us about this singular wave pattern here.
Okay, that single wave glyph can represent the concept of a wave or water, or of of energy. It represents electrical energy primarily. Mm-hmm. And the mouth glyph is more related to magnetic energy. Mm-hmm. Now, I need to back up a little bit and explain why you were talking about multiple meanings associated with symbols. I need to get at why that's the case. Mm-hmm. The Dogon are saying that we have basically three creational themes that they're concerned about. The first is how the universe forms. The second is how matter forms. And the third is how biological life forms. There's actually a fourth theme, which is how consciousness comes about. Those themes are parallel to each other energetically. And to emphasize that, they simultaneously describe all four themes using a single progression of symbols because the energetics are parallel. And so when we're talking about the shape of a hemisphere glyph, we can't ask what does a hemisphere glyph represent, because we have to be more specific than that. We have to say, what does a hemisphere glyph mean if we're talking about biological life? Well, if we're talking about biological life, it represents the expanded womb of the mother. If we're talking about the formation of matter, it represents the expansion of mass that precedes the formation of matter. So it's parallel meanings that take a different spin depending on which theme you're looking at it in terms of, but it's all the same concept. You get one, if you understand one, it's easier to get the other. But every one of these symbols has meaning for all four of those themes.
Gotcha.
Now, to make it more complicated, we have parallel energetics dimensionally all the way from the bottom of the scale to the top of the scale. And so what happens at the quantum level is the same as what happens if we're talking about one linear dimension, which is the same as what happens if we're talking about an area, which is two linear dimensions, or it's the same as if we're talking about a cube, or volume, which is three linear dimensions. What they don't tell us is on the other side of the scale, you've got energetic equivalents to those same three dimensions, which is why you have the Kanaga symbol in Dogon, which looks like sort of two E shapes, a backward E and a forward E in English connected together.
Yeah.
They represent, and it's the Vajra in Hinduism. It's representing the idea of a set of three dimensions. It's a set of dimensionality that comes in a set of three that connects energetically and then to linearly. There's parallelism on both sides. There's a spiral of energy on the material side, but there's a corresponding spiral on the energetic side.
Right.
There are concepts on the energetic side that compare to a water molecule. On the material side, we're counting up. We're counting up 1, 2, 4, 8 with dimensionality. On the energetic side, we're counting down 3, 2, 1. And the connecting point is a geometric point, which from a mathematician standpoint, a geometric point has no dimensionality. But Einstein tells us that we're not just working with linear dimensions. Einstein's the one who tells us there's such a thing as an energetic dimension, because he says there's a fourth dimension of time, and time is not linear. Time is not a linear dimension.
Right.
It's an energetic dimension. And so from the Dogon point of view, that geometric point does have dimensionality. It has the attribute of duration, which is a dimensional attribute for them.
Right. Right. And so when you were just speaking, it reminded me of when I was reading The Opening of the Way by Aisha Schwaller de Lubbock's.
Right.
The wife to R.A. Schwaller de Lubbock's, phenomenal, Kemet or Egyptologist who brought so much as far as the laying out of the temples and the shape of the man, and showing how various sections correlated with various parts of the physical body, which then also had their own energetic and spiritual significances. But she talked about somewhere in the book, I read it so many times, I don't even know where it was, but I know as I was reading that book, I came to the awareness that just as you're speaking, the twinness or the dual universes, the manifested or the material and the non-material, so to speak, and how every organ in our body, like for example, there's the physical heart, but then there's also a non-material version, like you were just saying, of the same heart. And one of the things that plagues Western science is, identifying where does the heart, for example, actually come from, You
Right.
could be the dopest cardiovascular surgeon in the world. You could be the dopest neurosurgeon ever, but you cannot answer where the heart came from, or where the first neural impulse comes from, right?
Right.
Of course, you could boil it down and say, well, the nervous system. So where did the nervous system get its first spark? Well, it transferred with the sperm from the father but then where did that come, right? And it sounds like, I've heard you mention that the Dogon actually do walk it back a little bit further than what modern science has been able to ascribe.
Well, actually a lot further. They
Okay.
walk us down to the point, okay, from the perspective of the Dogon and okay, the key authorities that I have from the various different classic traditions. From my go-to guy on Buddhism is Adrian Snodgrass, an Australian professor from University of West Sydney, Australia. Rene Guénon, who wrote in the early 1900s, who's the go-to authority on Hinduism. We've got Budge on Egyptian hieroglyphic language. Now, the modern Egyptologists don't think very much of Budge. They are very dismissive of him. But my problem is that if I start with the perspective that Budge is flatly wrong about the Egyptian hieroglyphs the way the modern Egyptologists say they think he is, then I can't explain why he's in predictive agreement with the Dogon, who he had no knowledge of. So essentially, I'm presenting the Dogon language as a body of evidence in favor of how Budge looks at the hieroglyphs. Because he can't be in consistent agreement with them and be wrong.
Right, because they're not wrong.
Right, because they're not wrong. And we can prove that because we have any number of other African languages to compare the Dogon language to. And it's not just that. The Dogon language is unclassifiable because it includes 18 subgroupings of words from other languages. And some of those are Tamil words, some are Hebrew words, some are Turkish words. Some actually are Faroe. You find in the Faroese language in Orkney in northern Scotland.
Wow.
Yeah.
And we're gonna get to Scotland because that's a heavy discussion. You get what the mystery of Skara Braid. We're gonna talk about that, man. We're supposed to talk about a lot tonight, right?
Well, if we don't get to it all, I can always come back another time. But
that's what's up, brother. Because I was hoping to make this an ongoing conversation, even if it's not, being streamed, for other people to participate in, but at least for us to continue to converse. Like I said, I'm totally fascinated with this. And it's like everything, every point I want to talk about, I'm trying to remember everything. And so I'm taking notes and I'm forgetting stuff. And it's just.
Well, I know how you feel because I get that way. And I'm supposedly the person who's got my arms around this stuff,
Right. That's how it is, though. But it's kind of like those, what are the electrons that pop up and disappear and pop up and disappear? It's kind of like that. Those are the same as these ideas and these thoughts. Real quick, I wanted to share a story with you. So I was reading The Secret Life of Nature. Okay. Peter Thompson, right? Yeah, man. And I heard you talk about how at different ages of time, we cycle in from being able to see be closer to seeing and interacting with the immaterial. And at different points in time, we're closer to interacting with the material than we are the immaterial.
Right.
And if you remember in The Secret Life of Nature, he talks about, all the different elementals, you got the fairies and the sprites and things of that nature. And I think you used fairies as one of your examples. A certain era, fairies were really real to people. And so I'm gonna tell you this, man. I was out meditating in my garden one summer. I was growing some eggplant, and I was sitting there looking at one of those purple flowers, and there was a small eggplant beginning to protrude from it. It was coming through, and in that moment, I realized that the flowers are actually the portals. They're the portals bringing the food from wherever it's coming from, and we can say it's coming from the roots up the stem and through, we could say that, and that's what makes sense. Yeah. But I didn't see a bulge in the stem. I didn't see that. I just saw this eggplant coming through this portal, and it continued to get bigger and bigger. And I saw that, and I immediately started thinking about the Egyptian hieroglyph of Ba, or the star, or the portal. And it was just like, these are ways that material comes from the non-material world. And the way that it's written in the Medu Neter, Ron Nefer book, is that it comes from the subjective realm. He says, which consists of consciousness, will, and energy matter, and then it makes its first manifestation. And then from there, it goes through those layers you were talking about, and it becomes an actual physical thing that we can embrace.
Right, exactly the way it's represented. but these are all phase transitions. A familiar phase transition is liquid water turning into ice.
Mm.
Okay. It's a natural consequence that if you get the temperature to 32 degrees, you're going to shift liquid water to ice.
Mm-hmm. Right.
At every stage along this process, all of these transformations are treated as phase transitions. So even down at the bottom of it, when you get down to the energetic source of things, you're still dealing with transitioning of phases of things that the Dogon is saying that the pattern for all this is water. And actually, the book that I'm finishing up right now, the manuscript I'm finishing up right now, I'm just now formatting, is about how that's true. It's demonstrating using the same dynamics of energy, how water actually can be shown to be the pattern all the way up the scale from the tiniest little, the first stirrings of energy to a hydrogen atom, that water is the pattern. If you look to what water does, you'll understand what the energy is doing. But science says that anyway. Science uses water as a metaphor for energy all the time.
And Bruce Lee did too. He said,
right.
It'd be like water, right? Very, very deep, small speech that he gave there. Let me ask you this, Laird. Were you all like as a child? Were you like intuitive? Did you have like a precocious type of nature? Were you peculiar as a child? Like very imaginative, crazy dreams?
No, actually, at age 18, I would describe, if you imagine taking me out, Amazon ships me and you take me out of the box. At age 18, I was the least, I would have considered myself to be the least non-materially connected person I knew. It was all transparent to me.
What woke you up?
That's hard to say. I mean, it was a process. Kabbalism defines many different classes of what they call mystics, based on the various ways that people connect to this stuff. Because you have, a psychic healer who connects to it in a certain way, and you have an Edgar Cayce who connects to it in another way, has to go into a trance to connect to it. You have people who have to have
psychedelic.
Psychedelics to connect to it. You're right, but there are any number of different ways that people connect to this stuff. I fall in the category of what the Kabbalists call a pure mystic, and a pure mystic is defined as a person who cosmological knowledge becomes available to them as they need it, as they require it.
Gotcha.
And so that's been my experience, is by simply having an interest in it and simply starting to pursue it, it becomes available.
You draw it towards yourself, so to speak.
Yeah, but that's true. In any case, I say, I talk about, imagine you're at a party and you're from Eastern Europe and you don't know English very well. You're not comfortable talking to anybody, but then you discover there's some guy over in the corner who speaks Ukrainian.
Right.
Now, the chances are you're going to spend the whole rest of the evening talking to that guy. Well, that's how non-materiality is with us. Samkhya says that the non-material domain has perfect knowledge with no ability to act. So, but it's making active efforts all the time to communicate knowledge and to induce action on the material side. So when it finds somebody who's paying attention, it wants to foster that. Here's a conversation. We're going to talk to whoever this person is, however it is they're able to get it.
Right.
We're going to try to communicate with them.
Wow.
So simply allowing that it's real, simply crediting it as being a thing that you want to pay attention to, is the way of fostering it to yourself.
So do me this favor, bro. Start focusing on me having billions and billions of dollars. All right?
Yeah, unfortunately, my powers don't extend that far. Otherwise, I would be earning more than 60 cents a book.
I heard that, man. This publishing thing is not what people think. It's not glorious and it's not glamorous at all.
I did the math one time. I think it worked out to about 50 cents an hour. So
yeah, see, I've got 10 books out, and I started a publishing company to push mine out. When I started looking at those, don't have the big marketing like as the Inner Traditions or something like that, but the return is a lot better than what I would have gotten had I gone with some of the contracts I was offered.
Right.
You just mentioned about the knowledge And I remember hearing you say this before. The immaterial has knowledge, but the inability to act. I'm paraphrasing, of course. And then
Right,
the material has the ability to act, but not the knowledge to do it, right? Something
right,
to that effect. And so
right.
it reminded me when I heard you say that. I'm going to have to plug my computer up. When I heard you say that the first time, it reminded me of the Oracle system that was developed by Ron F. Min as well. And he has, because I got this daggone background up, I can't show you the card. Maybe I'll drop the background just to show this card real quick. I want to show you this. But part of the Oracle system that was created, virtual background, let me cut it off. It's going to look crazy to do that in the middle, but I don't care. It's worth it. So none. Okay, here we go. Now you get to see my plain wall with my closet door, my level in the corner. So for example, this card here, it's one of the Oracle cards, but the part that I'm interested in talking about now is here. You see where you
Right.
have the two dots and then the two open spaces? And so one way that this is described of how to interpret it talks about, this is a balanced state of Hetep. And so the two and darkened circles mean that you have the ability to do, and the two empty circles mean you know what needs to be done.
Right.
And so there are different variations of this configuration, of course. So like here, for example, you've got all of the open circles, meaning that you know what you can do, but you don't have the ability to actually execute it, right? And then you've got another configuration. See if I can pull one out really quickly. Of course not.
No.
I'm trying to pull out one that's mostly full. Here you go. So then you have another configuration to where, they're mostly filled in. So you got a little bit of insight of what needs to be done, and you have the ability to do it, but you still don't know enough about it to actually exect it as needs to be done. It's my mind
That's
immediately.
very interesting because it goes along with how there's a system for making it easy for someone like you or me to place a symbol when we first learn about it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, there are a series of 4-stage metaphors that are given that give us a hint as to where it goes on the scale. The one that's familiar is water, fire, wind, earth.
Right.
But they're given in other ways, depending what your point of reference is. There's one that's given in terms of the stages of the growth of a plant, one that's given in terms of what I can say, creatures in the animal kingdom that goes from insects to fish to four-legged animals to flying birds. Okay, so for example, Kepler, the dung beetle, who represents the concept of non-existence coming into existence, is an insect, so he falls in the first category, his symbolism. But Thoth, whose symbolism is to the formation of the word and has the head of a bird, falls in the fourth category, which is this relates to the scale of the of materializing energetics. How far up the scale of materialization are we talking about? So your 4 dots are immediately familiar to me because that's the way things are classified for symbols in other respects.
Got you. Wow, man. Let's take a turn. Okay. Let's talk about Skara Bray.
Okay.
Am I pronouncing that correctly?
Yep. Well, okay. Yeah. I mean, they pronounce it with an accent. Skara Bray, whatever.
Okay. Right. Say tomato, but it's just so check this out now. So, I'm a Prince Hall Freemason, and one of my brothers, he deals with, ancient Egyptian and Kemetic culture and civilization and history, very thorough with it, brother Tahuti Evans. And he brought to my attention at one point that one of the early settlements, if not the original settlements of Scotland, was actually an Egyptian princess named Scotia, or Skoda, or something to that effect. But then I saw you break down this story, and you talked about the 2 different groups of people, the Twa or the Pygmy, and then a taller group of people there. If you don't mind, Laird, give us that story and that background in a nutshell.
Okay, Skoda, for my purposes, is a late representation. That story for me just supports the idea that there was communication back and forth between the British Isles and Egypt in ancient times. Okay. Now, about 3600 BC, which is more than half of a millennium before dynastic Egypt, someone on Orkney Island, north of Scotland, was teaching cosmology. This is where the first megalithic structures in the United Kingdom were raised. And what you have set along. In Neolithic times, there was a road that ran from these megalithic structures to for what's interpreted as the first farming village, but it actually looks to me like student housing for a group of 8 students and their families. You had a road that ran from the megalithic structures to that village, and each megalithic structure along that path represents the next stage, the shape of the next stage of the formation of matter in the Dogon system.
Wow.
Okay, now there's not very much evidence on Orkney Island compared to Egypt. In Egypt, you can hardly take 3 steps without tripping over a clay pot or a sphinx or a statue or whatever. On Orkney, there's almost nothing. So to try to get a toehold into what was being represented was a little tricky. Mm-hmm. I had to actually go to a children's book. There's an author who wrote a children's book about the Skara village and documented in his book, in his own drawings, what the layout of the architectural plan was of all of the original houses in that village. They were all originally the same. And it turns out the plan is a match for how the Dogon build a house when they build a stone house. The Dogon are living in a subtropical climate, so they tend to build out of mud and thatch, not out of stone. But when they build out of stone, they build their houses to the same plan, and there's a reason for it. There's a round room at one end. There are 2 side rooms that are sort of rectangular. There's a center room that's square with a hearth. On Orkney, there's a hearth in the middle. And at the bottom is the entryway to the house, is sort of a rectangular area. And the Dogons say that the house represents the body of a sleeping woman or a goddess. And the round room is her head. The side rooms are her arms. The square room is her body cavity, and the entrance are her sexual parts. Well, because the researchers on Orkney had nothing to connect their architecture to, they don't even have a theory as to what it connects to. I said, wow, since I can match the house plans, I now have authority to try to interpret other aspects of Orkney in terms of Dogon cosmology and language. And so I started noticing that place names on Orkney that have no etymology, no set etymology in terms of the researchers there. If you interpret in terms of Dogon or Egyptian words, it plays right out why the place was named what it was. There's a place called Stennis, where there was originally a stone circle, standing stones of Stennis, that are very important, still to this day are very important on the island. But they're connected to the idea of tracking the seasonal motions of the sun. Well, in Egyptian language, hieroglyphic language, Budge documents a word S-TEN. That means to distinguish between winter and summer. So working from the Dogon and the Egyptian languages, all the stuff started to make sense. Working from the Scandinavian languages, it didn't. And so all of that sort of opened up an entire book's worth of material to, by comparison to these other traditions that are completely out of the way from Scandinavia and that part of Northern Europe. You have to go to the Aegean and to go to Africa and go to, the Near East, like Turkey and Anatolia, to get connecting pieces back to this. As a matter of fact, what it looks like is another of my books actually traces clusters of elements. One of the reasons that the researchers on Orkney can't tie their evidence to anything is because they take it one element at a time. They say, okay, we have this ancient type of sheep, which we know was first domesticated in Turkey around by 6000 BC, but it might have made its way here by any number of different paths. So that doesn't tell us anything. All the domesticated animals came from there. And they do this again and again and again with each element. They hold it up and say, well, I can't positively trace this element, so I don't know what happened.
Right.
Instead, what you have to do is you take the various clusters of elements, all the original agricultural elements that were there, the linguistic elements, you take the societal elements like burial traditions, you take naming conventions for places, you take there are like half a dozen different clusters of these elements that all begin in the same region of Turkey around 9000 BC. and you can track it forward across the Aegean to the major islands, island by island, the researchers in the Aegean believe that there was a deliberate attempt to colonize the major islands for agriculture. And all of those same elements appear on Orkney a couple of hundred years later. So it's pretty clear to me where the tradition came out of, and it's very deeply rooted. It looks as if the Dogon involvement is this. The Dogon have elements that trace positively back to the Göbekli Tepe era at 9000 BC. There's an altar stone the Dogon preserve that is covered with carvings of animals that are stylistically indistinguishable from what you see on the pillars at Göbekli Tepe.
Wow.
And there's all language elements that also tie positively, and a bunch of other things that positively connect us back to Göbekli Tepe in 9000 BC. It looks to me as if a first round of instruction happened then at 9000 BC that was tried to be imparted globally. Göbekli Tepe sits in a very central location in Turkey, southern Turkey, central to many other land masses, and the ancient Chinese have the same things. The Middle East had the same things. Egypt had the same things. India had the same things. Africa had the same things. It looks as if there was a round of instruction that was attempted to be made globally. It looks as if the Dogon, 5,000 years after that, were the ones who had done the best job of keeping all this information straight. And so they were enlisted on Orkney essentially as adjunct teachers. They were there as the faces between the non-material, the non-material group that brought the material in the first place. They were concerned about the effects of their presence on us. The same way that when Moses was on the mountain, the Israelites were cautioned not to come too close to the mountain because of the bad effects.
Right.
Okay, so the Dogon's role was essentially to do the actual instruction because they were the ones who were on top of the material. And so when they would instruct a group of 8 initiates at a time, and when that group graduated, it looks like one or more of the African teachers would go with them to get them started wherever they were going to get started back in where they came from, to serve as priests, to serve as pharaohs, to serve as the head teachers, as heads of let's get this thing organized, let's get this thing started. And that happened in society after society after society, that a group of 8 was brought to Orkney, instructed, and then sent back to where they came from. And then the tradition was spread that way. That's one of Jung's archetypes also. The tradition of the 8 bringers of civilizing skills happens all over the world.
Right. And see, one of the purposes of Osir was to go out and civilize the world as well. So you see it in that story completed. So now you also mentioned though that there were 2 different groups of people there. Is that the same? Is this the same story?
Okay, so now the Dogon say that their teachers were originally non-material. They refer to them as Numo.
Right.
Now the Egyptian equivalent of that is a compound word. It's Nu-ma. Nu is a term for waves or energy, waves, water, or energy. And ma is a term that means to perceive. So literally the term means waves perceived. And the Dogon are saying that energy was able to take materialized form and interact with people. Now there's a perspective for understanding how that happens. We're dealing with an energetic cycle that's comparable to the Yuga cycle, where energy shifts over time. You can think of it as the shifting seasons of a year. It's the same sort of concept. But another way to think about it is what we're really doing is between the 2 domains. We have 2 domains that are taking turns being the less material one or the more material one. And so it ends up being like sand in an hourglass, where all the sand begins at the top globe of the hourglass and it slowly sifts down into the bottom globe of the hourglass. There's a point in the middle where you have the same amount of sand in the bottom as you have in the top. Now what we're shifting is energy, but not just energy. We're also shifting mass, which is how non-materiality has no mass and materiality has mass. And Einstein says when you increase mass, you slow time, the pace of time. So there's a point in the center of the cycle where the time frames of the two domains equalize.
Mm-hmm.
And at that point, it becomes scientifically thinkable, that you can cross over between the domains the same way that we equalize pressure with an airlock in a submarine to step out into the underwater, or in a spaceship to step out into space.
Mm-hmm.
If you can equalize the pressure, there's no problem crossing.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what's indicated as happening with these teachers on Orkney. Now, the reason why we have to think that the Orkney teachers are the same people is because the first reports from the Vikings, which actually were quite a bit later, reported two groups living side by side on Orkney, a group of short-statured mystics of very unusual habits, and living side by side with a group of average-sized clerics so different from the Scandinavians as to constitute a different race, but who always wore white the way the Dogon do.
Mm.
So it looks as if the Scandinavians accidentally caught and recorded in their sagas what the Dogon are telling us happened, only and on Orkney.
Wow. And the shorter stature mystics are equivalent to who the ancient Egyptians called best, for example, right? The
one Egyptian word for them is nem or nema, which is like nomo, especially when you realize the Egyptian vowel sounds are loosey-goosey. Mm-hmm. Nema could very easily be nomo.
All right, nomo, numa, it could be all those.
Right, so nema for the Egyptians, which means pygmy, mm-hmm. could refer to the short-statured numo for the Dogon on Orkney.
Wow, this is fascinating. So, and you mentioned in one of those lectures or communications that somehow or another they may have had some mechanism to literally transport people back and forth to wherever they were coming and going from.
Well, yeah, even the Egyptians claim there were gateways. I have very good reason to think that there were gateways. In fact, one of the energetic purposes of a structure like the Great Pyramid might well have been to foster conditions that allowed crossover between the domains, or at least communication between the domains. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I mean, the Great Pyramid acoustically has the potential to connect with vibrational energy all the way up and down this continuum of energy I'm talking about, all the way up and down the scale. Mm-hmm. So at very least, it looks to me like the Great Pyramid might be a way to communicate across the whole continuum.
Wow. Wow. And as you were speaking earlier, I also thought about the concept of the holistic approach, because you mentioned how they were trying to take this one thing about a sheep and they couldn't trace the complete picture by looking at isolating one particular element. And right. Immediately I thought it's the holistic approach that's necessary. It would be the same reason why Freud, would go in. He and Jung both studied, Jung said he couldn't be considered a mystic or, something of an elevated mindset, which Dr. Mystic, if he didn't go and study, amongst the people in Africa, they both studied down in there, the ancient cultures and civilizations. Jung actually took a trip in there. Quick sidebar. He wrote the introduction or the foreword to Wilhelm Baines' version of the I Ching, right?
Right.
And he tells the story about he was going to take a trip to Africa. And there's a book called Jung in Africa where he talks about this as well. He's going to take a trip to Africa, but he was using the I Ching to decide, is this the best time to go? And, right. It never showed up. And then finally said, yes, this is a good time for you to go. So he got that communication, that configuration to go ahead and go, and said there was an auspicious time. And so one time I was teaching theories of personality and I got to the section on Carl Jung. And I always bring in a big old duffel bag full of all my Jung books, right? Included in that is Jung in Africa and the I Ching, right? And so I was telling my students about, the I Ching and how Jung used it, and how, now it's discarded from our modern version of psychology as being pseudoscience and something of, just peculiar and particular to the Asian culture or whatever. But I wanted to show them that this was a very living and viable resource and tool. And so I said, who got 3 pennies? And so one of my students in the back of the room, she had 3 pennies. So she gave me 3 pennies. And so I conducted an I Ching reading in front of the class, right? And so the question was, I said, let's ask a question. Let's say, should Carl Jung go to Africa? And so I did the reading, and I can't remember which number of the hexagram it was, but it came back, the Wanderer, and it talks about a stranger traveling in foreign lands. And and one of my students was so shook by it, she literally packed her stuff and left the room.
That's great.
I love to show and prove this stuff, because I mean, I think that the more that we are able to bring that immaterial into the material, right? And to, from the material, engage the immaterial, it helps us to better understand who and what we actually are as human beings, right? And it helps us to tap into that infinite, vast resource that we have, And when you talked about, I'm still on that part where the two images, because I personally believe that we can develop ourselves to see the both simultaneously, right?
Right.
And it might be a matter of semantics here, because I think that we're saying the same thing by being able to differentiate that there is something different to be observed.
Right.
It's kind of like if we were listening to a song and there was a bell ringing, ding, and you never heard the bell, but I pointed out to you.
Right.
Now you can never hear that song without hearing the bell again after I pointed it out.
That's right.
And so to me, that's, in the psychological terms, that's that dual hemispheric functioning, to where I'm not just functioning dominated by my left hemisphere, very literal, very logical, very linear, but neither am I so, abstract and, dreamy that I can't concretize. I develop both hemispheres. We've got that bundle of nerves that connected to the corpus callosum, for that communication. And there are exercises and many initiation systems actually put their candidates through these practices to develop higher senses of consciousness, both awareness and awakeness, and that ability, as you speak of, to bring the vast and see it in the smaller versions of it or different levels of it. And I think that by cultivating those abilities and developing those cognitive tools, if you will, alongside the development of those spiritual tools, then we get that more holistic approach and holistic perspective.
Right.
Which, by the way, you display it wonderfully. I mean, it's just because you mentioned earlier the intuition, the intuitive part. A lot of this is intuitive. Einstein talked about the intuitive process. Everything was quote unquote out of the blue. Tesla.
Right. Yeah.
Tesla was out the blue, right? It just kind of hit me.
And also, science thinks that you've got to quantify everything to figure it out.
Right.
But the problem is, even Mikio Keiko, the physicist, says that when you get down into the quantum domain, things get so reduced in size that the math breaks down. So you can no longer count on the math. So if you're going to try to understand it, you have to first get a grasp of what's going on qualitatively before you can test that mathematically.
Right.
I wanted to step back to, you were talking about the two sides of the brain. One of my little pet theories about the brain is that in any given circumstance, there's sort of a mutual agreement between the halves of the brain as to which one's going to run with this.
Right.
Okay. And that laughter is what happens when you reach a circumstance where that hasn't been negotiated yet, and it takes them a while to figure out, am I going to remember this or am I going to remember this? And in between is where laughter happens.
Wow, check that out. When you said that, it kind of reminded me like the wolf pack, so to speak, and how the alpha switch up from time to time, just depending on what the task is, right? It's intuitively understood. Homie, you the best one to lead going over this particular terrain, and they'll rearrange themselves, and the leader would take over, the one that's better for that particular part of the road.
Are you familiar with conjoined? There's a pair of conjoined twins, a couple of young ladies who have two heads but one body.
Wow. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I've seen them. Yep.
And they each control the opposite half of the body that their head's on.
Wow.
Now, over the course of their life, they have learned to do literally everything any person can do, including ride a bicycle, drive a car, whatever. But when you see the kind of intuitive communication and understanding that's happening between these two ladies, as they're figuring out how to do a thing naturally, just as you and I would do it,
right?
You get insights into what's going on with the two hemispheres of a brain for any person.
Right. Wow. So you're saying that the one that's the one that's on the right head, I'm trying to be cautious how I label them. I don't mean no disrespect, but the one that's on the right, she totally and independently controls the left side of the body.
Yep. and vice versa.
It has no influence on the right at all, directly
Right.
anyway.
That's right. But they can run and play sports and ride a bicycle and drive a car and do all these things. Actually, they've ended up taking a job, last I knew, as teachers in the school. The school agreed to pay them a salary and a half. And the two of them teach a class.
Wait a minute. I'm sorry for laughing. They paid them. Okay, my bad. That took me up. So they paid them a salary and a half. And what was the what was the rest of that statement?
Well, just they're together. They're teaching a class as a teacher, and all their kids. They grew up in a very small town where everybody knew them and just accepted them at face value the way they were and never treated them any differently than any other kid.
Wow, that's phenomenal.
And yeah.
And so they have one digestive system, one pair of lungs, everything else is single, like single body.
Yep, but they have two heads.
I wonder if there's ever been any studies on them where they may render one head unconscious to see how the overall body would function with the one head unconscious.
Yeah, I don't know what they've allowed them to do and what they haven't, but you would think that everybody would be wanting to do experiments with them.
Yeah, I bet. You got to be careful. The experimental world could be very, very cruel, man.
Right. Now we're talking about the dynamic between non-materiality and materiality.
Yeah.
That cycle of energy also mimics a sleep cycle, but not in a human. It's the sleep cycle of a dolphin. A dolphin experiences something called unihemispheric sleep.
Okay.
It's what allows the dolphin not to drown when it's sleeping. Is one half of the brain goes to sleep while the other half is still awake, and then they switch.
Wow.
And that's almost exactly energetically what's happening over the course of the yuga cycle between the two domains of the energetic domain and the material domain.
Right. And so there are practices like dual nostril breathing or Dumo breathing, right?
Right.
Where you in and you hold and you come out the other side. That's, purported to balance out the functioning of your hemispheres. And those types of practices coupled with yoga, and all those other, Qigong, other esoteric practices, physical practices,
right,
are designed, from what I'm understanding, to bring you up to that level of ability, if you will, to go in between the material and the immaterial world. And they say that's how the ancient Egyptians were able to map out the duat, the underworld. And to quote the great philosopher Nasir Jones, he said, I'm sure he got it from somewhere else, but he said, sleep is the cousin of death. And, my understanding is that, I think that might be Shakespearean, but I credit Nas, man.
That's great.
But he was just saying how, basically my understanding is that, and from a matter of fact, J. Anthony West, he talked about lucid dreaming and how, the ancient commander walked through a doorway and said, am I dreaming? Nope. Am I dreaming? Nope. And then, I am dreaming, right? And you kind of wake up in your dream. And I'm understanding.
I've always had a high degree of control over what happens in my dreams. If I don't like the way the dream works out, I can rewind and do it over again until I get it right.
Now, was this before you turned 8? Now, because remember, I asked you about that.
From a very young age. That's always been true.
That's what I was getting at earlier. Remember when I asked you if you were like, I knew it had to be something. But I think it was, as we do with many children, we write it off as just, that's just a kid in their imagination or whatever. But a lot of times we have these, my understanding is that we're born with what we need to fulfill our purpose in life, right? And so we come with the disposition that we do. And those of us that are fortunate, we have the opportunity to actually put on the work for the greater good of creation as a whole, right? And I fear that so many of our gifts as children are squandered, because we're born into environments often that don't nurture or don't provide the outlet for us to be quirky, to be imaginative beyond what they think we should be, and to tap into these words.
The society puts limits on us that we shouldn't have.
Absolutely, man. So you're a professional lucid dreamer.
Yes, definitely. Well, I mean, even to these days, quite often I will awake with a chapter fully formed that I want to sit down and write, or with a solution to a problem I didn't know I had. You were talking about gateways to other domains.
Mm-hmm.
Vivid dreams are responsible for my sense that those not only did exist, but still exist. There are still functioning gateways between our domain and the one immediately adjacent to us. These are factors of 10 in the pace of time that differentiate these domains, exactly the same as science sees the electromagnetic spectrum. They break it down by factors of 10, from gamma rays to microwaves.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I wasn't even aware of that until after I had sorted out that that's what the Dogon and the Egyptians were talking about, is energetics that are laid out that way.
Wow.
And the Egyptian numbers system documents it. That at the scale of things where time runs 1,000,000 times more quickly than it does for us,
Mm-hmm.
the Egyptian number for 1,000,000 is the picture of a surrendering soldier. It's illustrating the concept of non-resistance, which is superconductivity.
Wow. I'm glad you brought that back up. Superconductivity. Thank you. I wanted to ask you about that because I've always heard of superconductor, right? But I've never heard it as it relates to magnetism. And it's under the threshold at which magnetism is awakened and it remains dormant. And that's such a phenomenal perspective of that. And I know it's
the sleeping goddess concept. Magnetism is the goddess.
Right. And so dormant does not mean absent. It just means not active.
Right.
And so what is it that allows electricity to resonate it because it can be controlled and kept there, right?
Yeah. Okay. From the ancients are saying things about the science that science isn't on top of yet, but I think the ancients are right about this. That what it boils down to is, okay, at the root level of magnetism, you're dealing with an energetic domain that is basically, we can think of as one dimension or as two-dimensional. It's the equivalent of a line, a geometric line. Okay, with magnetism, you have a north pole and a south pole. Now, in the context of a geometric line, that can only exist either with the north pole up or the north pole down. Those are the only two configurations. If you can create a circumstance with magnetism where all of the tiny magnets are aligned the same way, you get one of two things. You either get superconductivity, which is where magnetism is dormant, or you get something called superinsulation, where electricity is dormant. Mm-hmm. And it all involves the flipping of those magnets that you have. Have you ever played a game called Mahjong, or you're aware of a game called Mahjong? It's played with tiles. Mm-hmm. You start with all the tiles face down, and then over the course of play, like in Scrabble, you start turning things face up. Mm-hmm. Okay, well, that's what's happening with the magnets. And when you turn it face up in that domain, you've set the magnetism, what's called anti-parallel to the rest of the domain, which is a push. And so as soon as you flip the magnet, it automatically gets excluded from the domain because anti-parallel magnetism pushes. Mm. And so you're self-differentiating a second domain simply by flipping the magnets.
Wow. So when you were saying that, it reminded me of the action potential of a neuron. You know, when the current travels down, the axon, right? Yeah. The sodium and potassium, they flip as it goes down. I mean, it might not be the same thing, but that's what came to mind as you were describing.
No, I'm sure it probably is. In biology, the references I've been working with lately get down to what one of the biologists calls the primordial machine of life, which is a transition, just like you were talking about, between two organic compounds. One is called ATP, the other one is called ADP.
Okay.
Now, for biology, that's the same dynamic that's reflected in a hydrogen in the proton of a hydrogen atom. You might think you're looking at a proton. A hydrogen atom only has one proton. Mm-hmm. You might think you're looking at a proton, but protons have a natural tendency over time to morph into neutrons. The problem is that you can't have a standalone neutron for any length of time at all. So even though you're creating neutrons, they almost immediately transform back into a proton. So you have this oscillation of forms at the core of the atom and the proton of the atom. That really means that an atom it oscillates between having one proton and one neutron, which is what keeps it in sync with all the other atoms having the same number of protons and neutrons. Mm-hmm. But that interaction is the same as ATP, ADP, With a body of water, you have a similar interaction. You're constantly transforming from what's called coherent water, which is where the molecules are all lined up, the way I said they are in superconductivity, and you're creating a superconductive condition in a body of water or in an organism. And the second state is called chaotic water, which is more everyday, what we think of as everyday water. But any average cup of everyday water is constantly fluctuating between those two states so fast that they can't detect it unless they create special experiments to detect it. They kept missing it. They always thought it was just one state of water because you never got to see that coherent state.
Wow. So going back to that the superconductive state, I heard you mention that, and we'll be closing soon, but I heard you mention that in that superconductive state, I don't know, well, maybe it was either with the magnetic version of it or the electric version, but somewhere or another there are random spark. Well, I don't know about random, but there are sparks that occur.
Okay, what's happening is you have a circuit of energy, a free flowing circuit of energy in a superconductive state because there's no resistance to interfere with the electricity.
Right.
So it's moving ultra quickly at a very, very low pace, just above or just below the threshold necessary to invoke magnetism. Okay. Now, in that circumstance, any disruption to that circuit is going to create a spark. That can happen randomly, but it also can happen any time an outside energy interferes with the state. So, for example, Heisenberg says, when we're dealing with things on that small a scale, any simple act of observation necessarily has to disturb the state. So every act of observation we're making is setting off a spark in that domain and creating a response. It's temporarily evoking three monopoles. The spark is a monopole of electricity, and it evokes on either side of it what become a north and a south pole of magnetism. And those become a unit. Science calls it trinification. And that unit, because of the input of energy, flips over its orientation, now sits anti-parallel to the rest of the domain and gets ejected from the domain.
Wow.
Essentially, a superconductive state is like a gigantic reservoir of electrons and protons, because what you've just evoked there is what eventually becomes a proton in a hydrogen atom and the electron that looks like it's orbiting it. But in the superconductive state, we can see that they're interlinked together. It's a unit. And so by the time you get to the hydrogen atom and it looks as if the electron is moving out distances from the proton, science still understands that they're entangled, which they shouldn't be if there's a distance there.
Right.
So the distance is an illusion. This is we're seeing a magnification of the original distance that existed. All we've done is we magnified our view of it. So they're actually still entangled just like they originally were. We just have enough larger view of it that it looks to us like the electron moved out. And they can't actually image the proton. They have to infer from how energetic it is, how big it is, and the energetic doesn't change.
Wow. Couple things. Of course, got all kind of tangents spinning off of that, man. You remind me of the Book of Water and the Spirit by Malidoma Somé.
Right. One of my I had an African healing friend recommend that book to me without having read it herself. And it was the most directly connected to the experiences that I have had and write about of any of the books I've read, that he was describing his own initiatory processes. And I realized that my adult son and I had been inadvertently self-initiating because we were doing all the things he said.
And see, and that's what this thing called life is so ordered, especially for those of us who are fortunate enough to have awakened to it, right? And to be able to see the signs and the symbols and the indications as they show up for us, right?
Right.
As you were just speaking about the magnification of the atom, do you remember the scene where he came through one of his initiation rites and he saw an ant, but the ant grew very large? It kind of magnified for him.
Yep.
It was his perception, his ability to perceive it now was greater than what it was.
Right. I mean, I was in a cairn.
A who?
A cairn, a stone cairn. It's like a little man-made cave.
Okay.
Okay. One of his initiatory experiences is he spent time inside a cave, which he was required to do as part of his Dagara initiation. In the Dogon tradition, they describe their mythical ancestors as each one at a time descending into a cave, dwelling there for a period of time, and then coming out. Well, through the course of various things I've done, I had the opportunity one time to film inside one of these cairns. So we were inside of it for about 45 minutes and then came back out. It felt like a rebirth coming out into the world because you had to crawl through an opening to get in and out. But on my way out, my hand touched a stone on the floor. And I had an instant to decide, should I pick up that stone or not? And I decided to pick it up and bring it out with me. Then years later, I read Some, and he says,
that's right,
the initiated is expected to bring the stone out.
Yep, that's right. Wow. Back to the superconductive and those sparks.
Yes.
Does that relate? Because you have a book called Alma's Spark. It's one of your most recent ones.
Right.
Is that the spark that you're speaking about?
Right. That is the spark. Now, Alma is actually the force. Okay. Under the covers, when that superconductive state is actually a differentiated state. That's not the source. In the cycle of energy, there's a stage that comes before that where, according to Guénon and according to the science, what's going to become electricity and magnetism exists as a potential, but a potential that has a trifold aspect to it. And that what causes that to, and the science uses the term condense into these monopoles, is a spark of energy. So on the energetic scale, what we actually have going on 100% compares to what goes on with the cycle of water, that at that level you have the equivalent of water vapor condensing to form a droplet. At the next stage where it's ejected from the domain, you have the equivalent of let's see, I'm trying to think how this works. You have a point at the scale where matter collects, which is the equivalent of the water collecting in pools to run back to the ocean. So you have water vapor. Okay, you have water evaporating to form the droplets. So you do have the equivalent of that. Hawking radiation is the equivalent, and they actually use the word evaporation to describe Hawking radiation. This is the radiation that escapes from a black hole.
Right.
In the energetic cycle, becomes the precursor to what's going to be electricity and magnetism. It's a circle, and so you're going around the cycle again and again.
Right. So like you were describing, the same as the cycle of condensation of water.
Right. Now, the Dogon flatly said that. I read that 30 years ago in one of the easiest, most accessible books of the Dogon. It's a diary that Marcel Griol, the anthropologist, kept of his initiation. And he flatly says the Dogon compared the energetic cycle to the natural water cycle, but it reads like a metaphor.
Is that the conversation with Ogotameli?
Yeah, it is. Now, many of the things he says in that book play as if they're metaphors, but when you get down into the details of the energetic, and none of it's metaphor, it's all literal. It's a process of understanding how it's literal that makes a difference.
So, Laird, what do you think about this, man? Because I'm a bit of a skeptic, and I'm a bit of a cynic, and what I mean, I know rarely do we get actually what's happening. When things are reported to us through mainstream media, mainstream education, all that good stuff.
Right.
And so it's very difficult for me to believe that science, Western science, has developed on a trajectory all of its own. And then we find out that the Dogon, for example, and the ancient Kemetic people, ancient Egyptian people, had this stuff literally spelled out, and that the modern science did not tap into that. When we're talking about, I'm blocking all the people's name at this point. Sir Francis, all of the scientists that came up with all this stuff. And all of the looting of the temples and all of this, it's hard for me to think that science did this on its own. It's like, oh, wow, you mean to tell me that they did it too? To me, I would think, if I was a betting man, and sometimes I am, I would think that these folks actually studied this stuff, got into it deeply, came up with the science in hush, the Dark Ages, right? And then came up in this period of enlightenment, like, hey, we've got this stuff all of a sudden, Me, I think they got it from the Dogon and from the Kemetic people a long time ago.
Well, I mean, you said it yourself about Einstein. Einstein was not deep into study of this esoteric material, but the way he said he got his stuff goes hand in hand with it.
Yeah.
So it's not even necessarily that they had to get down into the material as you and I are talking about it. That's the way knowledge is communicated, and the people who are receptive to it are getting it.
Right. So they just tapped into the same source that provided.
Right. Tesla in particular.
Right.
It seems to have been really intimately connected.
Right. Right. And I just wish that those ways were more readily available today for more people to tap. And I guess, let me back up. They are. I just wish we weren't so distracted by all this other stuff to where we forsake that whisper that says, hey, follow this. Right. I just wish we weren't that distracted, man.
But it's all just whispers. I said in one of my posts today on Facebook, I said, anything that makes you scratch the head and go, what the fuck, is an entry point, because it was put there to get someone, the 1% of people who would scratch their heads and say that, to look at it. Right. So, I mean, when you think about male circumcision, it's an entry point, but one of the ways of understanding that it's an important entry point is because who in their right mind would decide to do that? Right.
Like, where did that idea come from, right?
Yeah, right.
Okay. I promised that I was gonna ask you to break down the symbol of Ma'at for us, okay?
Okay.
But the meta-nature for it. And
right.
So I'm gonna put it on the screen, and if you would, I'm looking forward to this. Let me do this. This is not it. Let me see. 1 second, Laird. There it is. This is it, right?
Yeah, there's another version I'm going to talk about. This is close. There's another version that's better, but this will get us there.
Okay.
Okay. The factor that's changing over the course of that dynamic of energy, the mouth glyph, the shape that represents the dynamic, the continuum of energy that goes from a point to a point.
Yeah.
The factor that's changing during the course of that cycle is the pace that time runs at, or that is experienced by the energy at those different points. Einstein says, when you create mass, when you increase mass, you slow time frame. And so science sort of conveniently ignores that. They're talking about a massless wave in the quantum world, and they don't allow for the fact that time is running all too quickly for it. And so transformations can happen all too quickly for it. But the way to imagine it is this. Imagine that you have an objective perspective outside of the whole universe. And you understand the objective length of a moment. And you know that because the speed of light is constant, that light can extend a certain distance during that moment. Okay, now imagine that someone came along and doubled the objective duration of that moment. What would happen is that light, because it travels at a constant speed, would now be able to extend twice as far as it had in the previously defined moment.
Right.
Okay. Now, science makes the mistake of thinking that the pace of time is a constant.
Right.
And that distance is a constant. But if someone snuck in the middle of the night and doubled the objective duration of time when you weren't looking, and as a consequence of that, it looked like distance had doubled also, it would now take you twice as long to get where you were going, and it would seem like you were traveling twice as far. So to your perception, it would look as if space had doubled in size.
Right. When
it hadn't. Well, what had really happened was someone doubled the duration of that moment. They'd slowed down time in half, the pace of time in half. Okay, so the word Ma'at in Egypt is a complicated concept that relates to truth and justice and harmony. It was the pharaoh's responsibility to maintain Ma'at in Egyptian society.
Right.
But the word Ma'at, the glyphs of the word Ma'at, I take as a cautionary warning, because the way they read is, if you bring your image back up, I'll relate to the glyphs that are there and try to spell out the ones that are different.
Gotcha. Okay. Here we go.
Okay. the adze shaped, the sickle shaped glyph, the second glyph
Right here.
from the left, represents the concept of perception.
Mm-hmm.
The first glyph represents the concept of a foundation.
Okay.
Okay. In the version of the word mot that I prefer, the glyphs read, perception is the foundation of measure.
Perception is
Or
the
it reads,
measure.
it ultimately reads, perception is the foundation of the measure of matter.
Okay.
Okay. Now,
And this is matter.
what that says is you need to be aware of the fact that how you perceive things intimately affects how you measure them. And so you can't rely on precise measurement to sort out what's true because the measures are changing on you and you don't know it.
Right. It's subjective,
Okay.
in other words.
Right. So now another proof that that's what's going on is the scientists can't sort out how it is that the universe, the further out they look in the universe, the faster it seems to be expanding.
Hmm.
And so they're imagining that there's something called dark energy that is responsible for accelerating, for pushing, giving it a push and accelerating it faster and faster and faster and faster as you get further out.
Mm-hmm.
What they don't realize is the further out they're looking back into time to a point where time ran more quickly than it does for us, progressively more quickly.
Hmm.
And so what they're really seeing is the effect of the slowing of our own time frame. Wow. It's like if you were on a train that was traveling down the track right next to a second train and one of the trains changed speed, it wouldn't be immediately apparent to you whether your train had slowed down or the other one had sped up or vice versa.
Right.
Well, that's what's happening with the energy in the universe. And another proof of that is that during the same period of time that the universe doubled in volume, the ratio of mass to energy also doubled. Mm-hmm. So there's a 1-to-1 correspondence between the formation of mass and what looks to us like the expansion of space. And I'm saying, based on the ancient references, that's because the increased mass slowed time down and made it look to us as if space is expanded when it hadn't. This ties back to what we were talking about with the hydrogen atom. It looks like the electron moves out from the proton, but in reality, all we're really seeing is the equivalent of a magnified view of it, because there's also time frame involved in that transaction. So when you slow the vibrational pace of that electron slows down, or it changes as it moves out. And so you end up magnifying the view of it so that it looks to us as if the electron moved out, when in fact, under the covers, it hasn't. Right. And so ultimately what you're doing is you're moving from the geometry of, in the continuum of energy, you're moving from the geometry of superconductivity, which is circular, to the geometry of superinsulation, which is square. You're reconciling a circle with a square, which is one of the major symbolic themes of all the ancient cultures, ancient Egypt in particular. Right. And Egypt even gives us the relative measures of the domains in those states, that it's reconciling a circle with a diameter of 9 units with a square that measures 8 units per side of the same unit. Those are equivalent volumes. Right. And so we're not changing volume at all. All we're doing is it's a phase transition from one state to the other.
So couple of things. One, I think I was voted most likely to explain stuff with an analogy on one of my trips.
I love it. I endorse that.
One of my trips to Gambia, I didn't realize somebody was taking notes with one of our friends. She was watching everybody, man. That was the award I got. But as you were speaking about the relationship between the expansion of mass and time, I immediately thought about, the Marvel movie Ant-Man. And, when he got bigger, it looks like he's moving slower. He's like, right?
Right.
And so they kind of slipped that understanding in there, if you know what you're looking at, right?
That's right.
The other thing is referring back to the opening of the way. They talk about the two witnesses, and it seems that one of the witnesses exists outside of this particular manifestation of reality, and therefore would be able to observe, like you said, if somebody sneaked into your room at night and doubled everything, you wouldn't be aware of it. But then there would be that witness. I can't remember if this is the personal witness, or I can't even think what the other name of the other witness was, but it was a witness that was kind of beyond the influence of this world.
Well, yeah. Well, the perspective is that non-materiality can see us, but we can't see them.
You can't see it. There you go.
That's what the Dogon masks are about. The idea of symbolizing, the idea of one party being able to see the other one, but the other one can't see back.
Can't see it back. Okay, and so that one that can see us, that particular witness, would know that it has been doubled,
Right.
and could maybe give you signs and cues that it has happened. Or Islam, they call it ayats. Get the signs. You might get something that whispers,
Right.
something changed. The Matrix, so for example,
Yep.
knock knock, right, and follow
Right.
the white rabbit. He could have chose to ignore all of that, right?
Right.
And went back to sleep. And so again, these ancient initiation systems were designed to tune our ears a little bit more sensitive to that whisper.
Right. Well, for me, the box in the book, or the book in the box,
Yeah.
was sort of the wake up moment. You can't ignore the fact there's stuff going on.
Right.
Now,
Right.
the meeting I had in New York, we returned from that meeting, and I found an email from a woman I had not at that point in time met, who's from Australia. She's a psychic medium.
Uh-huh.
And she said that all of her psychic friends were upset because they knew about the meeting in New York. And they were upset because I had been granted permission to research things that they wanted to research.
Wow.
And at that point, I hadn't told a single person about the meeting in New York. So
let me ask you this. I'm glad you went back to that. What was the spiritual tradition of that woman that was there with you all?
I don't even know. We met her years later, and she was just an average woman. There was nothing particularly mystical about her in the second meeting, but in the first meeting, she was at the time what you would call a bag lady. She was off the street dressed in sort of a random set of hand-me-down clothes, eating food with her fingers at the diner table, and just a very distasteful person outwardly.
Okay.
But right on point with what she was saying, esoterically.
One of those don't judge a book by its cover type of situation, right?
1 second here. My wife had something to say. What, Reese?
Did you tell me what would tell me who? Did you say what would tell me who?
Well, she wants me to tell you how that meeting ended.
Okay.
Okay. The last question she asked me was, who did I think was responsible for the system of symbols that I had been researching?
Wow.
She said, no, what she asked was, did I know who was responsible for it?
Mm-hmm.
I have to say honestly that at times along the process, it looks so much like my own work that I've wondered whether it's my work. But my answer to her at that point in time was that I didn't have any idea who was responsible for that. But what I did know, I had confidence that what would eventually tell me who.
Okay.
And she said, did you just say what will tell me who? And I said, yes. And she said, we're done. And she got up from the table and left.
It just left.
Now, this week, it finally occurred to me to look up Egyptian words. Okay, I have to back up a little bit.
All right.
We talked about Ren or Reina, the concept of this feminine energy that is sort of the overview of that jazz combo.
Got you.
Now, Reina makes routine attempts to communicate back and forth through messengers that are called, the Egyptians called them Aku or Akut. The Dogon called them Ogo.
Okay.
Another term the Dogon use are Tityeni.
Tityeni.
And Tityeni is translated as messengers.
Okay.
But when you look at Tityeni in terms of the syllables that make up the word, what it actually means is to send to say hello.
Wow.
Now, that's one of the little glimpses we get into the personality of Reina. This is a very sweet personality.
Right.
And the occasional other glimpse that I get into the personality of Reina is consistently just that sweet. Okay. Now, so this week, I finally had the sense to consider what are the Egyptian words that mean what and that mean who.
Right.
What reads, okay, these Aku are represented as orbs of energy. They can actually get caught. You can actually capture them on light. There's a researcher named John Burke who did a lot of exploration into stone cairns and Stonehenge and other stone pyramids in South America and so forth, and did scientific studies to show that based on ancient references that farmers would bring their seed into these sites and leave the seed for a period of time there and then go back and plant them.
Yeah.
He documented that you can get 100% better return on the seed if you bring it to the top of one of these pyramids for an hour and a half.
Mm-hmm.
So, but in documenting that, he would take photographs inside these stone cairns or at the tops of the pyramids. And when he developed the photographs, he discovered that there were orbs of light in the image that he hadn't seen when he took the photograph.
Mm-hmm.
And he had a physicist with him who explained to him what's happening is that the energy is actually there, but the flash of the camera adds just enough energy to it to make it visible for the moment the picture is being taken, and then it's not visible again.
Wow.
So he caught the Aku orbs on film. Okay, so this week I took the time to find those words what and who, and discovered the word what means that which is the source, and it's a picture of one of those orbs. And the word who reads is a stage of energy. So the whole thing together, if you combine the words what and who, you get that which is the source is a stage of energy. And that brings us back to the perspective I was talking about, that no matter where you're at along the continuum, and you look back far enough, you arrive at a stage of energy that looks to you like the source.
The what will tell
What
you
will tell you who.
And so, okay, here you go. So I listen to a lot of hip hop too. I'm a former hip hop DJ too, man. So the great philosopher Andre 3000, one half of the Mighty Outcast, he says, I met this gypsy and she hit me to some life game of how to stimulate and activate the left and right brain. She said, you only be as funky as your last cut. It's something, your ass would be a has what. Anyway, he went on, he says, the conversation lingered in my head for hours. And so you met this gypsy. She hipped you to some life game, stimulated your left and right brain. You sat with this conversation for however long ago it was. And this very week, it finally came to you to decipher the answer that you gave her to find the answer of the truth.
Wow.
This is so profound.
Now, when you combine those two words, the phonetics of those two words, what you get is the word akut.
Akut.
It's A-K-H-A-U-T as Budge interprets the phonetics. So when it's talking about the source being a stage of energy, it's pointing to those akut as being essentially the conveyors of that.
Yeah, those spiritual beings. I have a friend who I used to do names with divination, and part of her name was Eakut, which were the Eakuts, which were those beings. Yeah.
Wow.
Laird, I think we could wrap here. It's right at 11 o'clock. I think we have perfect timing on this. Man, I really appreciate you taking time out to have this conversation. I've thoroughly enjoyed it.
Well, thank you. Me too. Absolutely. I'd love to come back another time, pick a topic, and we'll try to dig down.
Let's do it, man. And so I'll send you a message once we get offline and, give you my other information. Let's keep the conversation going. Let's try to set up the next one, brother. I look forward to, learning more and contributing in whatever way that I can.
Great. And encourage anybody who might have a question to contact me either on Facebook, or if you want to post my email address, that's okay too.
Yeah. All right. Thanks a lot, good brother.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Good night.
Take care.